Hi everyone, welcome to Act 1 Scene 3 in Othello. We're going to make a start today on Act 1 Scene 3, but as Othello is a play of few scenes but very long ones, we'll see how long that takes us to go through. So let's get started. So Act 1 Scene 3 opens with the Duke's War Council and is really tightly structured and gives us an introduction to the Venetian court that we've heard so much about and the significance of what's going on here. And it begins with this idea from the Duke that there is no composition in these news that gives them credit. Which, well, if that doesn't sum up the rest of the play, then I don't really know what does. But the Duke is shown to be a more critical and reflective character than the valiant Othello that he relies on. His opening line gives that sense of him looking up and weighing the evidence. We get these of the Turkish fleet that show the sort of confusion and panic that Venice is feeling. We're really clearly suggesting that normal business has been suspended, which may account for the leniency with which Othello's marriage is greeted and perhaps account for the timing of it even. When he tells us, or the first senator describes, that it is a pageant to keep us in false gaze, this idea of the Turks making an attack on Rhodes, we're seeing Shakespeare here modelling the active critical listening he wants his audience to adopt, a skill that Othello is conspicuously bad at. Perhaps his lack of confidence in our tragic hero prevents his ability to be perceptive. But here, the Duke and the Senator are looking at and weighing up this evidence and realising it doesn't make sense, something which Othello is singularly incapable of doing later on. We also see the respect that they have for their opponents. We must not think the Turk is so unskilful to leave that latest which concerns him first. Othello is a soldier and used to a clear enemy. And he's entirely unprepared for the duplicity of Iago. So while we see here the respect that is given to a clear and defined foe, we see how unprepared they are for the foe from within. And this entire section feels a lot more like a classical tragedy setup to me. The pace and confusion leads us to believe that this play will concern itself with great affairs of state. Shakespeare does set this up, however, just to go in a completely other direction, which I always think is really clever. So we're going from this very sort of Grecian classical tragedy setup to end up with a very tight domestic tragedy. Some people might say, why bother? Well, I think why bother to create that bait and switch? So the audience, again, are wrong-footed and never quite know where they're at and what they're being expected to do. We've finished this little section here, the declaration from the first senator, here comes Brabantio and the valiant Moor. It's really interesting that the Duke refers to Othello by name, but uses the more about him. A lot of characters do that. Feels a bit reductive perhaps, or perhaps suggests that the equality of Othello is somewhat illusory. He's still known as the Moor amongst other Venetians. We then the welcoming of him, as I say, as valiant Othello, and there's almost relief implied by that salutatory valiant, which emphasises Othello's importance to the current crisis, and hints to us that Brabantio's cause is already lost, because especially as the Duke, oh, I did not see you, which I always makes me laugh. Brabantio's complete confidence in his brothers in the previous scene already feels misplaced. It already feels like he is the outsider in this room right at this moment, because in this room at this moment, this is a council of war, and Othello is far more belonging there than Brabantio is. So while this section may at first glance just be a crisis setup scene, I think there's a lot of subtle details about perception, understanding, problems with second-hand information and shifting values that make it really worthy of consideration before we then move on to the domestic complications that Brabantio would like to introduce. So by using that valiant twice from the Duke, both about and to Othello, it kind of shows us that this is a genuine opinion and does separate him from the racist ranting of Brabantio, who he did not see upon arrival. The importance of respect of Othello in the court is clearly established. Even when he isn't there, people speak about him with respect, even while still acknowledging his Moorish background. This contrasts to self-indulgent whining, declaring Desdemona dead to him, stolen and corrupted, and it seems that the idea of her own agency never really seems to occur to him, which really illustrates the patriarchal dominance he feels entitled to. He describes it as nature so preposterously to err. We're introducing this idea that Desdemona and Othello's relationship is unnatural. For those of you who studied Macbeth, you'll be very familiar with the idea of the great chain of being, and that is being somewhat upset. The natural order is being upset by this union, which can be interpreted no other way than in racist overtones. Brabantio is also shown to have passed from suspicion to certainty very quickly. Perhaps Shakespeare is foreshadowing Othello's own later behaviour. He may also be suggesting that he's not unique in his response to Iago's conniving. So Iago created this scenario between Brabantio and his daughter and new son-in-law, and everyone's fallen for it. And again, we'll see that replicated later on. Duke, fairly reasonably, having promised Brabantio the bloody book of law, when he finds out it's Othello, who's a bit of a pain in the bum, and he asks him, what is your part in this? And Brabantio is presented as a bit of a fool in this scene. His butting in feels really childish and ridiculous, as opposed to the menace and the quiet stateliness of Othello. Perhaps it's we don't see the journey, we're not focused on him, but it does seem reductive. And we contrast that to Othello's monologue here, where he acknowledges and openly sort of accepts his part in things. It is most true I have married her. He declares himself, rude I am in speech, little shall I grace my cause in speaking for myself. There's something of Henry V here for me. Henry declares several times that he is not a good public speaker, whilst coming out with some of the most famous monologues in Shakespeare's canon. But we do forget the impression that Shakespeare likes a soldier in peacetime, and the difficulties of this transition, and the way that these men are often struggling for the way to act like normal, in inverted commas, men. I'd really recommend you go and have a look at the Henry and Catherine speech at the end of Henry V for what I'm referencing here. So Othello claims not to be a skilled orator, though I'd argue that that's clearly untrue in this scene, but the humility and directness in this speech is definitely endearing. It's another way he's othered. He's standing amongst men whose lives are lived and steeped in rhetoric, as a man who feels that little shall I grace my cause in speaking for myself. It's perhaps false humility and a way of manipulating his audience, but I feel it's a true reflection of his own opinion. Othello is constantly aware of his otherness rather than belonging, which is something that will be exploited time and again. In contrast to this and his declaration that I won his daughter, Brabantio, I'd question if this man's ever even met his daughter. And again, we have here a prejudiced man setting up a character who then bears very little resemblance to that setup. So just as Iago sets up Othello, and then the Othello that shows up ain't anything like what we were expecting, here the Desdemona who appears on stage, who I really admire in this scene, doesn't bear any relation, for me, to this character that Brabantio describes. However, that's also part of what causes the problem for her, this tragic inevitability. Othello will remember how wrong Brabantio was about his own daughter, and that will help his own doubt to develop, because if she is able to hide herself from her father, then what else can she also always be hiding? Also of note is how Brabantio transfers his opinions to Desdemona. This father presumes that his daughter will be so obedient to even follow his own opinions. So for this example of things like everything to fall in love with what she feared to look on, well, quite clearly she didn't. But Brabantio presumed she would, and it didn't occur to him to find out her own opinions. The Duke, I love this line. He just goes to vouch this is no proof. So all of this and all of the support he'd given Brabantio in the abstract, when it comes to the concrete, and particularly when it comes to Othello, he's just going, yeah, this just sounds like you're making it all up. as he's continuing with this determination that Othello has used practices of cunning hell. Part of the problem being obviously that Brabantio's dislike of Othello and Desdemona's marriage actually kind of bears out. She does end up dead because of him, which I always think is a nice example of Shakespeare having his cake and eating it. And Othello comes up with the somewhat revolutionary concept of actually asking Desdemona. I wonder how surprising we should find it that Desdemona is going to be consulted on this. Brabantio seems content to keep this between the men, but Othello puts his life in her hands, showing his confidence in their love. This happens twice in this scene. It's a bit of a shame, really, but again, when we're talking about tragic trajectories, think about what's being established here. Move on and have a look at Othello's confession, as I normally refer to it, this big long monologue here. We open with the revelation that her father loved me, oft invited me, still questioned me the story of my life. Has Brabantio so quickly forgotten his friend? Or was Othello deceived to the nature of their relationship in the first place? There's also I think for a 21st century audience, has Desdemona run off with her dad's friend? Which again creates that distance between them. It's not just race, it's also generational. And it does suggest that Desdemona is like her father in some ways. They are both fascinated by the exotic Othello. Maybe part of Brabantio's upset is guilt. He feels he caused this situation to occur. There's also clues this is romance. We're told whichever as she could with haste dispatch she'd come again, and he often did beguile her of tears. I'd always thought of this as an impulsive romance, but this seems to suggest that it at least hasn't been Romeo and Juliet fast, though you'd be hard pushed to beat those two to it. We then hear a biography, which really does have, huge exoticism in it. Includes disastrous chances, slavery, Antris Fast and Desert's Idol, cannibals and anthropophagi. I mean, who wants the Othello origin film? It's all the rage. The tricky question, though, is Othello making this stuff up as the character, exploiting the naivety of his listeners, or is Shakespeare capitalising on the sensationalist tales of travel at his time and using the popular stories and ideas? I can't tell whether we're supposed to, whether Shakespeare was using what the common knowledge was of the day that, everybody knew to tell these stories, or whether we're supposed to be seeing that these are clearly somewhat fantastical and that these credulous gentlemen of Venice are therefore somewhat ridiculous. I think that might just be an answer lost in time. We're told that he observed Desdemona's interest and makes the first move in some ways. And again, we have to ask ourselves, particularly with a modern lens, is he perhaps exploiting the innocence and naivety of Desdemona? I think it often depends on how big an age gap they cast, but there is this sense of him noticing this beautiful young woman he's interested and making sure that he gets hold of her. We then hear him telling her the story. We get this really somewhat ambiguous line here, and yet she wished that heaven had made her such a man. Does she wish that she was such a man off on adventures, suggesting a woman chafing at the confines of her life, or that she could have a man like that, hence the marriage? I love this so subtle hint. She bade me if I had a friend that loved her, I should but teach him how to tell my story, and that would woo her too. The relationship does appear to be entirely from this point. And this hint, and then summing up these ideas, that she loved me for the dangers I had passed, and I loved her that she did pity them. It's a wonderful little couplet there to give us that sense that Othello feels she loves him for the thrill and excitement that he brings to her life, because, women are flighty and driven by surface emotion. But Iago manipulates this by suggesting that now Cassio is going to be more exciting than the older Othello. We're also forced to question whether that really is enough of a foundation upon which to base a marriage. The sense that this is all about narrative and stories, so perhaps foreshadowing, or when we get to the handkerchief discussion, calling back to this origin story. Thank you for joining me today, and I will see you next time.